Hello and welcome. Today's conversation brings together participating artists from the 2024 focus section titled Passages. In this conversation, participating artists Jeanne Silverthorne, Wright, Oliver Herring, and Wilmer Wilson-Four will be in discussion with Robyn Farrell, the 2024 focus section curator. Jeanne Silverthorne is a sculptor based in New York. Solo exhibitions include the Phillips Collection, Whitney Museum of Art, PS1, the Institute of Contemporary Art, Philadelphia, University of Kentucky Museum, and career surveys at the Wright Museum and Rowan University. Her work is represented in collections such as MoMA, New York, Phillips Collection, SF MoMA, Houston Museum of Fine Arts, and RISD Museum. Oliver Herring is a visual artist known for his use of experimental techniques. His first solo exhibition was in 1993 at the New Museum in New York. Over the last 22 years, Herring pioneered Task, a simple performance structure that manifests itself as an ongoing series of parties and workshops. Herring's work is in the collections of many major institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of Art, Performa 09, and the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. Wright is a Kentuckian who moved to New York in 1974 after studying with the artists comprising the nascent Harry Hu Imagist scene at the Art Institute of Chicago. With the city as subject, he documented the luminosity of the New York skyline at night and the flourishing queer landscape of gay bathhouses and bars throughout Manhattan. Wright is represented in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum of American Art, Metropolitan Museum of Art, National Academy of Design, Art Institute of Chicago, and Speed Art Museum, among other institutions. Wilmer Wilson-Four investigates the representation of Black bodies in contemporary life. Based in Philadelphia, Wilson-Four is concerned with the way that Blackness is shaped in and by city space, and inspects the relationships between figure and environment through his employment of urban materials. Wilson's work can be found in the collections of the Baltimore Museum of Art, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the Phillips Collection, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Robyn Farrell is the senior curator at The Kitchen in New York, where she organizes and oversees exhibitions, publications, live and online programming. Before The Kitchen, Farrell was an associate curator in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Art Institute of Chicago, where she served on the curatorial team for 50 projects, including career surveys with Barbara Kruger and Greg Bordowitz. Thank you for being here today, and with that, I will turn it over to Robyn.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Zoe. A big shout out to Zoe and Thomas, who have done so much for the programming. And I just want to also thank the Armory team, including Kyla and Tyler and Reese and everyone that has been so wonderful for all of us to work with. So I want to acknowledge them for all their hard work. I'm Robyn Farrell, as Zoe said, and I am thrilled to be here to be in conversation with a selection of some of the artists included in the Focus section, which I organized this year. Just to give a brief overview of the section to set the context for the conversation. I titled the section Passages because I was thinking about both storytelling and history. When I was invited to curate this section, I had just moved to New York from Chicago, and the invitation came as we're having New York curators participate in the fair, and I was like, I'm still Chicagoan. But I immediately dove into the history of this fair and its context in New York, what it meant then, what it is now, how we're looking at the future. And so I was very interested in capturing the artwork and the artists that have been part of this visual lexicon over the last 30 years. And so, like turning a page of a book or listening to a score, each booth presents itself as its own autonomous space, but as part of a greater story of, the joys and the traumas and the challenges and the engagements of living in contemporary life. With that, I want to welcome everyone to the stage, Jimmy, Wilmer, Jeanne, Oliver. I'm going to spend a few minutes with each artist talking to them about the work that's on view here and talking about their practice in a larger sense, and then we'll have time for questions. Jimmy, I'm going to start with you. Part of the text for this section is kind of looking back at the history of the Armory Fair in its early beginnings at the Gramercy Hotel, but your presentation of work in Corbett versus Dempsey and Fearman's booth is looking into your history when you first arrived in New York in the early 1970s. And when we all spoke last week, we talked about a lot of different themes, about how all of these artists are engaged in documenting life in one way or another, through everyday objects, through a range of media, really what it means to evolve as an artist in an urban landscape, and thinking about all of the considerations with themselves and a greater humanity. So I'm wondering if you could set the stage for us with the work that's on view and give us a glimpse into your practice.
I moved to New York in 1974, and right in the midst of New York's financial crisis. And if you've seen the work in the Fearman Corbett versus Dempsey booth, there are drawings from my neighborhood, Borum Hill, of sex workers. So during the day, it looked like a reasonably safe middle-class neighborhood, but at night, the street was owned by a couple of pimps and a couple of girls. It was as raw an environment that one can imagine. It's sort of as if sex trafficking was happening on the stoop, and in 2024, it happens on your computer in your home. So it's all come inside. Driving here on the West Side Highway, seeing the environment, seeing this convention center, and of course it all reminds me of Shanghai. Compared to New York in the city scenes that I'm showing in the booth, New York for me was both a terrifying place because I didn't know how I was going to survive financially, but it was also, I knew I was moving here as a gay man, as it being the only place I felt safe. So in the midst of all this sort of social decay and economic decay, I found safety, and I found people like me in numbers. So the city, there are two bodies of work. The city paintings are this sort of dark Gotham skylight of fantasy of what New York can be. And then there are notes of all the gay clubs that I went to, the social life at Max's Kansas City, the kind of vitality that artists create wherever they are in the world.
The other day when we were talking, you said something that I've been repeating quite a bit on tours this week, which is, the one word Gotham is yes. What, I felt really stuck out to me, and especially this, if you're looking at the image on screen here, the larger painting is quite, it's a beautiful work that images never do it justice, but it's a beautiful work that's like foreboding, but very romantic, all at the same time, which also sounds a bit like your initial experience. And so we talked about what the different layers of being in that context of, kind of a very urban space, but we also then came to this notion of collapse and how like your productivity actually came out of that city that was in a moment of collapse?
I could only, all I did was get on the subway train to go to Manhattan. It was like the second week in New York, I knew I'd made a dramatic mistake. I didn't move to Manhattan, I moved to Brooklyn. And even though it's the hub, all I did was ride the train, it seemed, and my destination was always Manhattan. So the trains were, you know, completely covered in graffiti, so you were constantly surrounded by signs of rebellion and being in an anonymous city, someone leaving their initials, saying, I'm here, I'm an individual. And then it itself became a culture. So in the 80s, of course, I knew Fun Gallery, and I know, and the ironic thing is, by chance, I lived across the street from Jean-Michel Basquiat's mother and father. So Basquiat, I just knew by face as a teenager on the block. And when I moved to the Bowery in the 70s and attended a Soho opening, suddenly Jean-Michel walks up to me and says, hey, you're that artist that lives across the street. So, but it's this whole idea there was political corruption and political failure to heed the signs that this big financial crisis was going to occur. And of course, we depend upon, as a unit, we depend upon public transportation. Whether you individually take it or not, where you work, everyone that works there, which we now call, after the pandemic, essential workers, they are all dependent on public transportation. So it was like your basic sense of survival, everyday survival, was impacted by this crisis.
And I want to talk just a minute. I mean, we have these other beautiful images of your work that are not included in the booth, but maybe I can use this as a segue insofar as another thing you mentioned to all of us in our conversation last week is all of the works here, and in general for your practice, they were all rendered from memory. And you had said some might have been hours after you would witness something or experience something, or could be weeks or could be months. And I thought that that was really sort of a truly remarkable note about this body of work in particular, is that, you know, we see both intimate views of your time in that moment in the city, and then we see these sprawling sort of like landscapes. And I'm curious, with some of your more recent work that we see here, is this also based in memory and reality, or is there something more that how did you get from there to here?
So late 70s, early 80s, we were learning there was a virus in the gay community, and we were hearing about gay cancer. And my partner was diagnosed in 1988. And previous to that, even though they had developed a blood test to determine whether the virus was present, you didn't dare take it because at that point there was no anonymous testing, and because if you tested positive, you could lose your insurance could be canceled. So Ken was diagnosed in '88, and essentially it was 3 years of critical illness. And I was the primary caretaker. And the intensity of trying to keep a job, trying to take care of Ken, and also helping other friends. One, I didn't have a regular daily routine, and it was, how can I paint as reclaiming my own time and being in my own head. And my strategy was I had disdain for still lifes as an art student, was never interested in still lifes, but they don't move, and I'll set one up, and I'll go in and out of the studio as I have time, and with a still life, I don't have to think about what is art. I'm just simply recording what I see. So the large sunflower, which was the first image, was one of about 6 paintings that were done over 3 years. So they're an accumulation of time and an accumulation of observation. And what I was doing, in a sense, unconsciously, was recording emotion and feelings and the passage of time. If I have great absences from the studio, I know I can automatically return to the flower as a motif and immediately step back into my creative place.
Thank you. That's so beautiful. We come to this idea of observing in time and absence, and it segues into Wilmer and your work in so far as we've talked a lot about the notions of visibility and invisibility that you get to in your practice. And the work that you see here that's on view at Susan Inglett's booth are these beautiful, moving, organic-looking, two-dimensional works, but upon a closer view, you see that they are a methodically installed series of staples. And so at the start, I had talked about how each of these artists works with their practice insofar as their environment and this notion of the everyday. And so here you're quite literally using this utilitarian office tool to make these remarkable images. And you've done this in other ways in your practice with your performances as well. And so my question is, how do you utilize these objects as metaphors? Secondly, to call in our conversation from last week, I think specifically with these works, the experience of seeing them in person is very important. So we talked about this idea of an embodied experience and recalling how that experience might have been with the first Armory show in 1913 and how Americans were confronted with European modern art for the very first time. And so there's that tie-in as well with the history of this fair. So I will hand it over to you to poke at any one of those prompts.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to show the work here. I have spent basically all of my artistic career in service to skin as a compositional device. I'm interested in the way that skin forms by accruing small ephemeral objects, connecting them into a network. And then I'm also interested in the way that skin becomes an interface between the body and its environment, its context. I think a lot about the Sarah Ahmed notion that the body shapes the space that it's in, and conversely, space is constantly structuring the body. And I think skin is the site at which that kind of tension or conflict plays out. So the images, I'll describe a little bit how I got to using staples, I guess, just talking through some of these performance works. No, yeah. So I think of, I'm interested in exploiting the history of people, human lives being converted into flesh, being made into an object, right? And conversely, I'm interested in treating material as if it has a life of its own. So the image before was a performance that I did in 2012 called Henry Box Brown Forever. It's a sort of eruption of the history of the figure Henry Box Brown, who escaped slavery by mailing himself in a box to the free north. And I use that as a kind of recipe for orienting myself towards the postage stamp and making postage stamps, or sort of using the realm of performance as a way to synthesize like a speculative being that is comprised of skin that is also something else than like the organic kind of skin that we all live in. And skin is, there's so much pressure placed on skin in the realm of the visual that a lot of my work is also about rethinking the possibilities of the visual of skin. So this kind of accrual of small objects and the placement, the patterning, and also the sort of semantic content of the small nodes of the skin all come to bear on the meaning of the body and the way that it can occupy space. And so maybe we can go to the next image, and then, so conversely, at the same time that I've been doing performances, I'm also making these sculptures. Like I said, I'm interested in the way that space structures the body just as much as I am in the body structuring space. So I've found myself progressing into more architectural work and thinking about how architectural elements can, structure embodiment. This is a sculpture that I made in 2017. Basically, it's a wall made of blocks of salt. So it's maybe 3 tons of salt blocks that are an agricultural item, an agricultural sort of supplement for chattel, for cows and things. And I found this archival letter that was sent to a Mississippi sheriff threatening to burn the entire state and poison the livestock if the lynchings of black people, the extrajudicial killings of black people didn't stop in the 1910s, 1920s. There are 2 different versions, so there's another side with a different version, but what I wanted to describe here was the way in which a wall of salt becomes something that is attractive to chattel, and in that way it sort of draws out or draws forward an audience of chattel, has the capacity to draw forward an audience of chattel, which is, I want to be thinking about how to orient space in that way, or how to make work that can, reimagine the possibilities of structuring human and non-human experience. And so maybe in the same vein as the work that I'm showing here, I have continued to make essentially they're sculptures that are fragments of like provisional architecture. You mentioned staples as an office item, but they're also like a pedestrian material. They're a thing that you find as a record of like a attempt to share ephemera in the street. And so I started to imagine like what an embodiment would be like if skin were made of staples, and then also like what staples as a kind of organ what kind of function they might provide to like a wall system, right? So I've been making these, I started with this staple work by using found photography and coding them in these staples. So these works are probably 120,000 staples, and enough to accrue the presence of a skin over top of the surface. And like you're alluding to, they sort of demand a structured viewing from an audience in that they selectively reflect light. They make it difficult to access what's underneath, and they kind of take on a sort of vitreous squishiness or something like this that's I think unique to the material, and hopefully suggestive of some sort of like infrastructural imagination that is like yet to be explored, or could be heightened or thickened in public space. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have one question, brief question for you. Maybe it's not so brief. How long do you spend on one particular, or is it ranged? I mean, I'm just curious.
Yeah. I have come to enjoy stapling as an improvisational practice, right? So
Lovely, yeah.
It is akin to drawing in that it can hold an immediate relation to itself, or it has the capacity to sort of encode like an improvisational relation to mark making, and so I try to do them all at once, but it does end up taking probably like 40 hours, let's say a work week, yeah.
Wow.
In as large of chunks as I can manage at any given moment, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Jeanne, we're moving to your work, and here is a view of the Mark Strauss's booth here at the Focus section. And to say that both you and Wilmer have a Philadelphia relationship, so, but what we've talked about is how your work deals, of course, not in using maybe everyday objects, but in referencing everyday objects, and how the environment of both, you've been in Philadelphia and New York, but how your studio becomes an actor in your practice. And so I myself have been interested, and I've heard you speak about it, but I thought it might be nice to ask you to speak a little bit about your process, because I think that initially it's maybe difficult to understand what material your work is made of, and then we can you can expand from there. And yeah, please prompt me as you'd like me to forward the images.
I hope you don't mind, but I have trouble speaking off the cuff, so I've written things down.
Wonderful.
Anyway, I want to talk about the 90s, which I suspect Oliver will want to talk about too, and in many ways it has a lot to do with the 70s. I wasn't here that early, but the 90s were also a period of collapse. And they were very seminal for me personally. And I'll say more about that in a minute. As you can see from many of the pieces here, I'm interested in the body, and in that I feel I have a lot of connection with you, Wilmer. But by the 90s, the body, which had always been vulnerable for me, had also been impacted by feminism, by LGBTQ awareness, monumentally by AIDS, by artists of color such as Kara Walker and Lorna Simpson invoking the enslaved and colonized black body, and by such scientific innovations as the photoelectron microscope, which I used repeatedly in early works, and by cloning and developments in DNA, which is also an image or a concept I continue to use. But in the early 90s, many things were also in collapse. The art market, galleries bankrupting weekly. You felt sort of one jump ahead of the bailiffs. You'd have a gallery show, the gallery goes out of business. You'd have another gallery show, it would close. It was like leapfrogging across a river from one submerging rock until another. But on the other hand, out of this vacuum, 1,000 flowers of alternative spaces bloomed. Thread waxing space, the clock tower, AC project space, white columns, and the Gramercy Hotel Fair, which became the Armory. And many of these were artist-initiated, and because nothing worldly was at stake, innovation was rampant, and there was a camaraderie and what has been called a reverence for the marginal. But another thing happened to me in the early 90s, and that was that I began to feel a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit anomalous in the studio. I mean, I was a woman working in the site that was heretofore occupied by the white male genius, and a site that seemed itself to be in a state of collapse and anachronism. And mine's a very traditional method. I tend to model in clay, and then I make a mold, and then I cast, albeit I cast in rubber. At that time, a rather unorthodox material, and it's still the material I use almost exclusively. So not only was I assailed by the sense of being a woman in a male history, but this was the time when we were just beginning to hear the rumblings of the beginning of the digital revolution. And some artists were already choosing to run offices, or to outsource, or to shop. In fact, I did a large installation around then in the 90s, which addressed this by creating 3 scenarios for art production. One room addressed the digital, another room addressed the assembly line factory model, and the third addressed the handmade. Anyway, meanwhile, paradoxically, despite the market collapse, studio rents continued to rise and rise and rise and rise. And so everybody was constantly moving regularly from one studio space, which became unaffordable, to another studio space. And these tended to be dilapidated buildings. In my case, it was a flooded basement, an abandoned rat-infested floor, and places with their own history of suffering bodies, former sweatshops. And yet, I was in love with making things by hand, and with the fact that I would have in the studio what Virginia Woolf called a room of one's own. So the question was how to continue. And I thought, well, okay, if the studio is a ruin, couldn't it be excavated like an archaeological site? And so my excavation initially involved inventorying items in the studio, its debris and its artifacts, and casting them in rubber, and copying in rubber the outmoded infrastructure of my particular space, where newer plumbing and wiring was just slapped on the walls on top of the older stuff, sort of creating a genealogical map of the space. And throughout the 90s, and even today, I use these rubber replicas of electrical wiring and outlets to create site-specific installations. Out of all the outmoded fixtures, the most ubiquitous continues to be the bare light bulb, that signifier found in countless studio depictions, from photographs of Giacometti's studio to countless Gustin's. And now maybe we could have the next slide. Suddenly, oh, I'm sorry, it's out of sequence. That one, yes, okay. Suddenly, however, the image of a chandelier just popped into my head, and I felt an irresistible urge to make it, which I did in clay, and then I cast it. And obviously, there was no chandelier in my studio. But I eventually figured out that this was yet another anachronistic and dysfunctional lighting device, and yet another emblem of collapse. In this case, it was the collapse of the Enlightenment project itself, with its, suggestions of impressive pre-modern illumination. The chandelier conjures up the era of such Enlightenment thinkers as Diderot, Voltaire, et al., with their belief that the truth will make us free, that progress is always good and inevitable, and that man is a rational creature. Except guess what? By the 1990s, none of this seemed true. And therefore, the chandelier was completely blacked out. Not only that, but the modern backup system that's supposed to come on when the main system fails, that emergency light with the battery-operated lights on top of it, that too is blacked out. The whole thing is dysfunctional. And all the wires and all the electrical outlets that connect the exit sign to the chandelier are copies of the wiring in my studio, as is the exit sign. Anyway, that sounds very despairing, but eventually I realized that the studio was not entirely a dead zone. In the studio's dilapidation, everything goes to seed, and life appears in the form of weeds and insects entering through the cracks. Now maybe we could have that other slide, that one there.
Okay.
Kind of going. Next one. That one, yeah, okay. So this is my studio floor with dandelions coming up through it and roots coming up through it. And so there have been many, many works over the years in which an invasive but hardy nature colonizes the studio. Meanwhile, archaeology's unearthing of the buried and bringing in the concealed to light suggests deep storage, and many works address what is invisibly packed away, either behind rubber bubble wrap or hidden in crates. Since 2007, I've tried to make a functional rubber crate for every sculpture. A piece is shipped out to its venue in the crate, which once unpacked becomes part of the exhibition. And now you could maybe see the last slide. That one, yeah. So here's an example of a piece that gets shipped out in its crate. And here I feel a real connection with what you were saying, Wilmer. From the beginning, there has been a phenomenological conflation of the studio and my body. The guts of the studio are my innards. Its pocked walls are my skin. And even now, as you can see in this piece, Double Sneakers, my figure is constructed out of the 2x4s, here cast in rubber, that are a staple of studio clutter. So one last note. I know you think I'm gonna go forever. I have often incorporated into my project writing, photos, videos, and kinetic sculptures, but rubber remains the constant. It has a fleshy quality, which connects it to the body. However, it's also the perfect material corollary to collapse. Rubber won't stand up, it's disobedient, it wobbles, it flops. This can be a humorous kind of slapstick. And in that comic subversiveness, I hope that there are echoes of the joyful anarchy of an earlier art world that some of us were very privileged to experience.
Thank you so much. I appreciate how these threads between all of your practices are kind of coming to the fore, especially this idea of observation and material, but really the body and how it exists in space. And I think this is a wonderful nod to you, Oliver. And this is Oliver's booth at Banks, Oliver's work at Banks' booth in the Focus show. And I should note that both you, Oliver, you and Jeanne both had been exhibited, right, in the early years of the
Yep.
fair. So I meant to note that at the start. And I know, Jimmy, you had gone to the fair. So we have many notes of history here. But the work that you see on the screen that's on view at the stand comes from this moment in time in the 90s. And Oliver, I am going to kind of hand it over to you to kind of speak about, pun intended, the interwoven connections of your work, from photography to sculpture, weaving, and performance. And I think that I wanted to kind of touch on all of those points, because not only is that active in the booth, but you're also performing this week as part of Armory Offsite. And so kind of this kinetic energy of your practice is very much being, it's paralleled with the actual programming for the fair. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and you let me know when to advance the images. Okay.
Thanks. I think that because I landed on art by default, I was going to study medicine. My relationship to art is perhaps a little different from a lot of my friends and peers, who always felt that art was their only language that they could speak or communicate through. For me, when I landed in art school, I learned that art serves as a very useful platform to learn how to be creative, how to think outside of a box, which has served me throughout my life in good times and bad times. So really, I use my experiences with art as sort of a toolkit to process what needs processing, the good and the bad, but especially the bad stuff finds a place. I feel very often less helpless when I work my way through a problem. And the two projects that are being on display at the Armory or with the Armory, work that I made in the early 90s to 2001, and the Offsite project happened also during a time of duress, the COVID pandemic. And that's right, you took that photograph last night. But let's quickly go back to the 90s work. I came, like Jimmy, and maybe you too as well, I came to New York as a place of refuge. In a way, I grew up gay in Germany, and it was a way too conservative environment for me. So as soon as I finished high school, I left. I went first to England, but to art school, and which is why I ended up with art, because I couldn't communicate verbally. So I applied to an art school and got in. And when I came to and while I was in England, I saw a performance by Ethel Eichelberger. It's actually very hard to say what he was, because he was so many things. He was a performer, a playwright, a clown, a drag queen. He used gender in his work, and I saw the same performance twice in a row, which was for me back then a big investment. And it was the same piece, but the audiences were different, and the performance was radically different. And I just fell in love with this kind of flexibility and how he used the structure of his work to connect with an audience. It was a very powerful counterpoint to the much more muscular fare that was presented in the 80s in galleries and museums. And it was seeing Eichelberger, experiencing Eichelberger, that made me want to come to New York to expose myself to people like him. But a year into my MFA here, I learned that he had committed suicide because he had AIDS, which completely changed my work. I actually ended up making these knit pieces initially as a tribute to his preoccupation with gender. Back in the 90s, knitting was still considered a gendered craft. But also it served me to process my next step, because at that point I was painting. Knitting allowed my hands to produce something while my brain could process. And it wasn't planned, but I ended up knitting for 10 years, which transformed this project into some sort of prolonged meditation on the passage of time, on mortality. But also, this was an investment of my own time at a time when really I wanted to be out there, be young, and explore the city more actively. Instead, I was sitting in the studio knitting. Long story short, like anything, it had to come to an end. It became too excessive, and I started to cater to other needs. So video became a natural outlet to be more whimsical, to process everything else. And then that just brought me in contact with more people. And then once I started to work with people, my interest shifted to that. The performance right now that I'm doing at 302 Bowery for the next 2 days is also sort of an homage to a queer performer who died prematurely. The dancer, choreographer, Václav Nijinsky. And during the pandemic, during the AIDS crisis, during the other pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, not being able to do what I did for the decade preceding it, working with people, I had to sort of refocus my attention to my own body and find agency within that. And I did this insane thing where I decided to use Nijinsky's ballet L'après-midi de Faune, Afternoon of a Faun from 1912, as sort of a starting point to explore distortion, because he was inspired by Greek depictions of figures in Greek, Egyptian, Etruscan vases and frescoes, the flatness of that, but also the beginnings of early film, which must have been mind-blowing back then, seeing a body in a two-dimensional surface. And so his choreographic score is attempting to be as flat as two-dimensional as possible, which resonated with me profoundly during the pandemic when we couldn't move, when we couldn't socialize. So I'm a non-dancer. So I taught, and I'm 60, and I taught myself this sort of iconic ballet, and perform it as a solo in conjunction with 2 other pieces.
Thank you. I wanted to just fill in a blank here where when you were talking about when you finished weaving and then you began to work with people for the last 20 or so years, you've been doing kind of performance-based engagement, right? The serious task. So I just wanted to fill in the blank there for everybody so that it really is, I love this kind of bookendedness to how, the COVID kind of brought you back to your own physical body after kind of this very long period of time working publicly with others. I don't know if you have other images.
I had
so let's, yeah. We should speak about the disco ball. And how are we on time? We don't have any time. Okay, so maybe just say a few words about the disco ball and then we'll open it up to see if we have any questions. We're good? Okay, thank you.
This is actually one of the last pieces that concluded this 10-year project. I wanted to finish it in a more abstract way. Up to then, I'd been knitting. My main vocabulary was just mainly coats that were based on a coat that I had in the closet that fit me. So there was this sort of autobiographical component to it, and sheets that became blankets and mattresses. Just these 2 components. It wasn't so much about making sculpture, it was more like using the most economical means to create a language and then express something that was much bigger than the pieces. But with this piece, and there are 2 other pieces like that, I wanted to finish in this conveying that the party was over, that an era was over, that my time knitting was over. So I wanted it to be on the floor. I've always been really drawn to work on the floor because I think one of the most profound experiences I've had coming to the States was seeing the AIDS quilt in DC, which is thousands of individually sewn panels that pay tribute to loved ones that were displayed on the ground. Sorry, I'm getting emotional thinking about it. But the relationship to the ground, the place where we come from and go back to, has always really resonated with me. And with this piece, it just needed to feel gravity. So the ball actually could be filled to 6 feet, which is my height, but it's exhibited normally at about 5 feet to have this sort of deflated component to it. Yeah, that's all I want to say about it.
Thank you. I mean, thank you to all of you for sharing and being so generous with your stories and your practice. I want to give the audience a chance to put forth any questions if you have them. And we have a microphone, so just you could raise your hand because we'd love to hear from you. And if not, I always have questions. Yes, thank you. We're coming around with the microphone. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all of you for being here. This is my first year coming to the Armory, although I know a gazillion people. I was looking a couple of you up on social media. We have mutual friends. And this is a question for all of you. especially if you have been in the art world since the 70s coming to New York, what do you find has changed the most in terms of getting your work out there and the competition and survival for an artist? What is different about now as compared to back then? That's for everybody.
Money. I mean, the decade I was talking about, with its marginality and its ad hoc qualities and its camaraderie and all that, was precisely because there was no money around. And then when money came into the art world again, we also had the explosion of the spectacular spectacle. We had an embrace of, very, very, very high production values, which cost a lot to make. We had a more corporate model for galleries. And I don't want to say in any way that this hasn't produced amazing work, because I think that it has. It has produced some pretty incredible work. But that is, for me at any rate, and I think for most of the artists who are my peers, and by that I mean not just my age, that is the biggest difference. And I don't know that it's necessarily connected, or I don't know how to connect that to your question about how to get your work out there. But certainly when so much money is involved and you're in your studio where you have to have the job to pay for it, which keeps you out of the studio, which is always, it can seem insurmountable, that's all. But I am a firm believer in community, in art community. And I teach, and I always tell my students, you are each other's audience, you are each other's way of making it into the art world. You create the art world. You are the ones. And they do it. I see them year after year. I see them do it. So I still believe it was true for me that it was my friends and I who made our art world, and I see it with my students. I see them making their art world, and that hasn't changed, I don't think.
I would also like to add that, we all have different expectations of what we want from this, but I would encourage you to create your own infrastructure. Like this piece, the performance that I'm exhibiting here, I did this for 2.5 years in my studio to word-of-mouth audiences. The audiences were usually between 1 and 5 people, but it gave me control over what I was doing and how I was putting it out there. And my ambition was not, and still is not, to show this in museums and galleries. But right now we're showing this in a rented space. It's in the former Patricia Field store. And, I think it's important, in fact, that artists figure out additional ways to being out there in the world with their work, because the machine only serves certain kinds of art, and there is a lot of other valuable stuff out there that has to find outlets and ways of surviving. And they're really, it's a good question. It's a complicated question to answer.
Details of the performance this weekend.
Just ask for more details about the performance.
Tonight is a performance between 8 and 9 o'clock, and it's at 302 Bowery. It's a half-an-hour performance followed by a half-an-hour conversation with a cultural figure. So tonight's conversation will be with a curator who is particularly interested in dance and performance, named Jeanette Bishop. Tomorrow will be Kyle Croft, who is the executive director for Visual Aids. The performance tomorrow is between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. 302 Bowery, yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Wilmer Wilson. I really appreciated how you spoke about the staples in the street and those being a residual suggestion of pedestrian activity and sharing. And I was wondering if you had a relationship with that object in a shared way or if it referred to the passage of time. Have you ever involved others in the making of your work, for instance, or yeah, I'm curious about how time and the staple and that sort of social consideration relates to you.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think especially when staples are encountered in a pedestrian way like you're describing, they sort of accrue a patina which alludes to time. There's a rusting that happens, a discoloration. There's a kind of interaction with the wood underneath. And I am interested in the way that like the act of stapling is itself a record of time in the works. There's a kind of vicarious understanding of labor and of time that is encoded by virtue of the accessibility of the material. People understand what a staple is and how it relates to their lives and what it takes energy-wise to put into a piece of wood. So yeah, there is a kind of transfer of life force and of time that happens, yeah, vicariously to a viewer that I'm interested in. I am interested, like you're describing too, in the possibility for staples to be organized collectively. I hope that the compositions that I'm making here suggest that possibility, and that's part of one of the things that I'm interested in using the space of art for, is to kind of suggest or encode like a blueprint for action in the street, or to, yeah, even kind of suggest a way of arranging or organizing ephemeral things in a way that makes them less ephemeral. I think, yeah, like what decays and what is not decaying is a political question, and things can decay faster or slower depending on how many resources they're afforded and how much organization they're afforded. So, yeah, I want them to be a kind of like speculative blueprint, and I hope that the act of viewing art is not a passive one, you know, for viewers. I hope that they do suggest these things, you know, to a collective, to an audience, and that's at least my interest in making work, is to provide these kinds of entry points for others to adapt and apply and employ into their lives as is seen fit, you know. So, yeah, I hope it can be a way of organizing action for others too. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to ask just one more question, and it's to Jimmy, and it relates to the passage of time. And so I loved how when we were looking at your work, kind of the still lifes, you talked about how they can represent time, and just now to make this a full travel back, have you thought about revisiting the figure in going through this organizational period with your galleries and kind of looking back to see, I mean, the dynamism of how you captured, you know, people and figures, and I just am curious, has it conjured any sort of a renewed interest at all?
It has conjured a renewed interest in the figure, and I've had, I've been working with pastel, and I've been drawing from observation from a nude model. And what I realized, I can again concentrate entirely upon the observation and responding to the materials. So the challenge was I used specific brands of pastel that crumble, that are in a sense you're like drawing with sugar.
Back to collapse.
Yes, exactly.
Oh my goodness, I didn't mean to cut you off, but it was quite poetic. Well, that's exciting. I look forward to maybe seeing some of those someday. I just want to thank all of you. Thank all of you, Jimmy, Wilmer, Jeanne, and Oliver. It's really been a wonderful time to spend with you and hear about your work. Please come visit the Focus section. Thank you.